decline in birth rates has meant a decline in population growth, and the most immediate effect of this is likely to be a shrinking size of the working age population. So the working age population in the U.S. has been stagnant for over a decade now, and given the decrease in birth rates we've been experiencing for the past 15 years, in the not too distant future, again, absent an increase in immigration, we're simply going to have fewer people of working age. Now that's consequential both in a fiscal sense, meaning that it's going to put fiscal pressures on our social security system, funding for Medicare, disability insurance, but it also poses economic headwinds in the sense that you have fewer people of working age, and that doesn't necessarily just mean fewer people to produce stuff, lower economic activity overall. More worryingly, it could mean lower GDP per capita, or a reduction in productivity per person, a reduction in living standards.
Which could have profound effects, obviously, on investment, particularly in the United States. So what can we do about it? Can we get that fertility rate back up, or do we have to find a workaround?
Yeah, so here's where I think we can draw lessons from other high-income countries, Japan, UK, Canada, other countries in Europe, including Scandinavian countries, that have been dealing with below replacement level fertility for many decades. You know, the first thing I would note is that despite efforts to turn things around, fertility has remained below replacement level in those countries for many decades. A lot of those places have implemented explicitly pro-natalist policies, things like baby bonuses or child tax credits, expanded parental leave, expanded subsidies for childcare, all things that should make the cost of having children lower, or the ability to combine work and kids easier. And yet the evidence from those kinds of incremental policies is that they might lead to some modest increase in birth rates in the short run in particular, perhaps not persistently, but nothing of the size that we would need to really lead to a dramatic reversal of the decline in fertility or the stubbornly low fertility rates anytime soon. So, you know, that suggests that it would be hard to turn things around. And again, because it looks like what we're seeing is really just a move away from having children or having multiple children as opposed to any sort of temporary response to some discrete change, suggests that it's going to be really hard to turn the fertility rate around. So where does that leave us? Well, the obvious thing is to think about increasing immigration. Now, easier said than done in this country. Congress has been sort of derelict when it comes to immigration reform for far too long now. But given these demographic trends, the imperative for immigration reform, for allowing more people to legally enter or stay in the country, becomes that much stronger. And there's lots of sensible reform proposals out there, ways we could do this. We could certainly have more of an employment-driven immigration system where, you know, like other countries do, including Canada, where we allow more people in who are reasonably likely to contribute right away to our economic productivity. We could also increase per-country caps on the number of family members who are allowed to immigrate to the country or stay in the country. Beyond immigration, of course, again, these demographic headwinds emphasize the need for policies and conditions that promote innovation and productivity growth. Easier said than done, though recent spending bills in Congress aimed at investments in infrastructure, increases in spending on scientific development, all of those are encouraging, all of those are steps in the right direction, but getting innovation policy right is very hard, and it will require a lot more than just spending. It requires having the conditions in place for competitive companies and innovators to flourish and thrive. This is something that we take up in our report that you mentioned. And of course, it will require a lot of investment in talent, not just importing global talent through more immigration, but also really building the talent pool among our native-born population here in the U.S.
That report is from the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, and I really highly recommend it. It's fascinating reading. It's really terribly important. Thank you so much for sharing it with us today. That's Melissa Carney. She's professor of economics at the University of Maryland. And we're going to continue this discussion about changes, fundamental changes that will affect the plight of CEOs, particularly. We're going to talk to Sam Palmisano, the former chairman and CEO of IBM, about how the paradigm has shifted for the average American CEO. That's coming up next on Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
Bloomberg Radio, on demand and in your podcast feed.
On the latest edition of the Bloomberg Business Week podcast, a conversation with Bloomberg News Senior Executive Editor Stephanie Flanders on why the global economy of 2023 is going to be a wild ride.
So what's useful about doing this exercise for Business Week, and I've done it a few years now, is you sort of, obviously you're quite caught up in, especially these days, on exactly what's going to happen to the economy this year, and are we going to get our heads around inflation? Is the Fed going to stop tightening? But you also want to step back and think, okay, how has the world fundamentally changed? And I think this was one of those years where I thought, wow, we really have had these fundamental assumptions underpinning maybe 30, 40 years of global economic history, certainly my lifetime of thinking about economics and thinking about the world, all having kind of been kicked away over the last couple of years. It's not just cheap energy prices, it's not just cheap labor costs and transportation costs, and as you said, the sort of friction-free period for geopolitics, at least when it came to, am I going to find it fairly easy to set up a complicated supply chain in Asia or China? And all of that has gone away. On top of all that, you kind of, every time that any one of those pillars was sort of shaky, you always had the Fed put, right? You always had the Fed there, super easy money, kind of free money to make everything make the numbers still add up. And when you start looking ahead and thinking, okay, if those have gone in quite a lasting way, decoupling, whatever you want to call it, as well as potentially kind of higher interest rates sticking around for a while, that could mean something quite fundamental, not just for economic growth, but also for global policy.
Get more of this and other conversations on the latest Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Subscribe on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Plus, listen anytime on the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Bloomberg's The Year Ahead event returns to Davos on January 17th to map out a strategic blueprint for global business in 2023. Against the backdrop of the World Economic Forum, join leading CEOs from across the globe, including Jane Fraser of Citi and Larry Fink of BlackRock, in dissecting critical issues. Topics include taming inflation, geopolitical tensions, environmental priorities, and the future of work. Help shape the conversation for the year ahead. Learn more at BloombergLive.com/TYA 2023.
Chief Executive Officer has a nice ring to it, but it's harder than it looks. You have to respond to forces far outside your control, like, say, the weather, at least if you run an airline like Southwest.
We're doing everything we can to return to a normal operation. Please also hear that I'm truly sorry.
And pretty much every CEO is subject to the whims of the economy overall, particularly if you're serving consumers like Pure Gym.
We're concerned about consumer spending, and hence we've launched memberships which are lower priced, off-peak, saver memberships. And I'm concerned about inflation in costs as well for us, of course.
On top of the usual, in recent years, CEOs have had to deal with the vagaries of a President Trump declaring a trade war with China.
We don't negotiate trade deals. Trade deals get negotiated, and we operate our business accordingly.
And a once-in-a-century pandemic that brought business to a halt.
I was blown away during this pandemic that everything had changed. Here I am in my office and nobody else is there.
Even when things started to come back, a lot of your employees didn't, at least not in person.
There's challenges around onboarding employees in an entirely remote way. There's challenges around feedback and recognition, promotions, how you organize teams, how you keep them motivated.
But now CEOs are facing something they haven't seen for many years. Slowing growth, higher costs, continued inflation, and interest rates that are taking away those days of free money.
When I talk to business leaders, certainly at the moment, they say that what the headwinds that they're facing now is almost more challenging than it was in the height of the pandemic.
So if you're a CEO, you have to come up with a whole new playbook. And if you're an investor, you need to make sure the company you're putting in your portfolio can adjust to a very different business environment. And now we turn to a seasoned CEO who has been in the C-suite, has done the job through good times and bad. He's Sam from Sam, great to have you back here with Wall Street Week.
Thank you, Dan. It's good to be with you this morning.
Okay, so the CEO always has a challenge or two in front of him or her.
Yes.
But right now, things may be turning a little different. We're seeing real inflation for the first time in a very long time. We're seeing increased interest rates. Give us your perspective of what the CEO today has to do in 2023 that maybe didn't have to do in the past.
Well, you're right, David. The conditions have changed dramatically, and I think I'll say some disbelief out there because some people actually believe perhaps there's going to be a soft landing. Now, I'm not smart enough to know whether it'll be a soft landing or a recession, but I think the circumstances that the CEO is dealing with are the same regardless of market conditions. And why do I say that? Because you mentioned points. Macroeconomic slowdown, no doubt about that. Whether it's a recession or not, that's just how you measure things. It's a slowing environment. Pressure on consumer spending because of the economic environment, obviously, right? Labor costs, energy costs, material costs, all going up because of inflation. So these are the operational issues that you deal with. Throw on top of that supply chain issues associated with decoupling and whatever China does or does not do going out into the future. So fundamentally, it's a very complicated equation. And my perspective, if I was still doing the job like we went through in 08, you'd have an alternative plan. You could say, okay, these are the positive assumptions. That would be perhaps the soft landing case. But let's have another case that says that these factors go on longer than people are forecasting. That inflation continues, slow growth environments continue, let's say for 18 to 24 months. Then it's a different scenario that you have to plan for.
So Sam, as you suggest, we don't know what's going to happen, so you have to have more than one plan.
Exactly.
But take the perhaps downside, a more modest case, which is lower growth. We have had really robust growth.
Yes.
Stimulated in part by fiscal and monetary policy, frankly. Lower growth, higher cost of capital, higher interest rates. How is your plan different? What is the different way you look